All right, we're starting. Great.
Starting the things. But we were talking about sports. Do you do any sort of intro to your thing?
Oh no. Oh no, I gotta mute the stupid.
Yeah, I had to mute it too.
There we go. Yeah. That's awkward. Yeah, I don't have enough viewers to put on the thing. I feel like I get about 10 people, I guess. At least that's what it says, and I think it's probably less than that. You always get the impression they're boosting the numbers, you know. But
more than I get.
Yeah. It's interesting. Social media is like a thing that it just kind of. It's not really social for everyone. It's more of I mean, it's not a platform for it is in theory, but
right.
And understandably, it becomes like an aggregating place where you.
Right.
Why listen to some guy that has 10 subscribers when I could, follow the big kids, I guess, the big boys.
Because you're special. Yeah. I don't know, man. Everyone's got to start somewhere, right?
Yeah.
But we were talking about sports. Hey, see, we have a Kelson. Kelson's hanging out.
Oh, good. He's he actually wants. Hey man, I meant to send him. He wanted to chat about this too.
Oh, sure.
He doesn't. Well, I'll let him explain himself. But he says he knows less about the subject, but he's interested.
Sure. So, I get that. It's become a growing topic of interest in my own heart and mind. Come on, Pooter. All right, I'm going to have to close something here. I'm closing my view of your YouTube window because I think this canvas I'm working on in Photoshop is 30 by 40 inches at 300 dpi.
Oh,
so yeah. I am crushing RAM right now.
Yeah, that'll do it.
But yeah, we were talking about sports, and I was just explaining that the Jaguars kind of they were real big to me when the team first came, and then I kind of fell out of it. And then my first job out of college, I was working at the local NBC ABC news station as a film editor, and I had to work Sunday nights, and so I would be coming into the stadium in the middle of the football games, and the stadium was right next to the news station. So I would have to drive through all the game day traffic, all that stuff, and then I would have to edit all the news pieces that involved the game and all that. So like when I started working there, I got back into it as an adult, and then ever since then I've just been a huge Jaguar fan, and so it's been. But I got back into them just in time for them to be bad for 10 years and have one good year in the middle of all of it. So.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I remember. Like when were they awesome? It was like 2002 or 3. I mean, they might have been more awesome since then. But
well, the real good years were their first 5 years or so. They were really good.
Yeah.
And then they were in the playoffs in 2005 and 2007, and then we didn't have another playoff berth until last year.
Yeah.
And so they went all the way to the AFC Championship game last year. They missed on the Super Bowl because of a bad officiating call, basically. If the call would have been in our favor like it should have been, which we came to find out, they would have probably won the game. And then this year they were really good to start the year, and then injuries just took them over. Like so many injuries, it was ridiculous. And then they were just bad because they couldn't overcome it.
Yeah.
And their quarterback wasn't playing well, and that's sort of important in the NFL. But yeah, I like sports a lot. It's
sure.
It's just for me. It's just like one thing that doesn't involve comics or art. It's just something I can. If anything, it gives me something I can completely relate with people who aren't into my world. We can at least talk about fishing and football and all that stuff.
I need to I need a normal hobby.
Hmm.
I'm trying to do fishing more.
Fishing's fun, man.
Yeah, it's nice. Like I don't have to coordinate with others to do it, so that helps. Just kind of dive in.
Yep.
But
for sure,
it's tough. But it's a fun kind of tough, I guess.
Yeah, I was really getting back into it, and like my mom got me a nice like heavy duty fishing pole. I was excited to get out there and do some more fishing, but it was for Christmas, and like it doesn't get super cold here in Florida, but on the water it gets cold enough to where you're like, why are we out here? This isn't comfortable. Like the wind is blowing heavily, and you can't, I just don't feel comfortable. Like I went out a couple weeks ago to go fish with a buddy of mine. We woke up early in the morning. He went and bought some live bait. We got there and it felt great in the parking lot. And then we got out on the pier and the wind was just like going. And it was so uncomfortable and so cold that we maybe got into 30 minutes and we were like, all right, let's just go have breakfast. This is not fun at all.
It was crazy cold the past few days.
For Florida, for sure.
Yeah. It's crazy. I thought I moved south enough that I'd finally not have to deal with that, but it's not the case.
Nope. It's cold pretty much everywhere. Just the degrees of cold.
Yeah. Seems to get hot everywhere too. I work with a lot of people from the north, like Minnesota and stuff, and they're like, "Oh yeah, the summer's really hot."
Yeah, I've been in New York City in the summer, and it's just as uncomfortable.
Yeah,
it's not, super moderate or anything. It's pretty bad too.
Yeah, I think Kelson's gonna come in.
Okay.
In a bit, but we can probably start now.
Hey man, get me going.
Yeah,
get me where you want to go.
Well, I'm interested. Okay, so last time we were chatting, we got a bit into it, enough to say,
let's not keep going.
Yes, and also that like our initial impressions have always been that I guess like from the outside looking in at first, it looks like like oh crap, like some of this already happened.
Yeah.
And
the possibility that maybe some of this already, maybe there's some validity to that argument.
Yeah. And maybe you start feeling like you're missing, like suddenly what you thought was talking to you isn't talking to you. Maybe that's the impression that I kind of got when I first looked at it, and then I was thinking, well, what else am I missing? What else isn't for me?
Yeah,
you know what I mean. Like, and you start feeling like you have unsure footing for a second, and then you realize preterism isn't scary at all.
Yeah, no. I mean,
reassuring in a way. So
yeah, fairly enough. Like it might not be biblical. I don't know. Like it's, but I could say the same thing about futurism. So it could be either. I think it was just allowing yourself the space to say, hey, there is a tradition steeped in orthodoxy here. Like it's not a widely panned as cultic or anything. It has short footing and some really brilliant theologians. And so why have we chosen one over the other? What's led us to that conclusion?
Yeah.
At least that's how I approached it. I was like, wait a minute, why have I never heard about this until I was like 34? And then I'm 34 and I'm just now finding out that this is even an interpretation that anybody holds. I just was like, whoa, I feel like I should know about this already.
Yeah, and especially I get the impression, I mean, I don't know what your experience was growing up. Like I became a Christian around, I was late, I was 15 or 16.
Yeah, around the same age.
So. I went to I was atheist, and then I was Buddhist, and then some girl said, hey, you should, I'll go on a date with you if you go to a Bible study. And I was like, oh, whatever, I'll just turn her atheist. Then,
little did you know.
Yeah, exactly. And that was interesting. And then, but it was like an independent Baptist kind of situation. So I heard, which I don't know, I guess it's independent, so you can hear anything and everything in theory,
right,
still be independent Baptist. But my experience was I heard a lot of things that I don't know. We just didn't hear that. I guess orthodoxy was very narrow. I guess.
yeah,
You know what I mean? Like what's considered beyond the pale.
yeah,
Was larger, and I didn't know anything, so I was just like, okay, I guess this is what it is, and there's only one view. And what was it? I had an Eastern Orthodox boss in college, and he was throwing, I mean, just wild, like way outside of what I was used to kind of stuff. And that got me thinking. And then I guess just from that, having a assumed kind of Baptist background, and then from there, hearing things from more of an Eastern perspective, like somewhere in between, I was like, I don't know where I'm going. And then a cousin of mine, who's a Presbyterian minister, like sent me some Ligonier stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Was like, hey, just watch these. We were just watching these R.C. Sproul videos, Sunday school, and like watched them all like in one day at work when I should have been, paying attention at work. And I was like, I've never heard of this either, and it's kind of made what appeared to be, I guess, like the defense mechanisms that I was taught to think like should be going up about something like preterism. That I learned to lower those defense mechanisms, because I realized these people have, like, higher critical scholars have some valid concerns. I think they're noticing that the New Testament talks a lot about this generation, and there's a clear expectation, and that's one of the main criticism they have of the veracity of the Bible in general, is that clearly Jesus expected he was going to return in some sense, that Israel was going to be judged in some sense, and that
and it didn't happen.
So it didn't happen. So Christianity's invalid, and if we're just going to ignore those complaints, those criticisms, then I don't know. I guess we do it at our own peril.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I grew up in a Southern Baptist church. Yeah. So the scope of vision was very narrow, and not to discredit them, like they believed that was true, and they were trying to keep us in that, in those lanes, and that doesn't offend me as much as I get as much as but I also think where they got things wrong was that the argument became more about their point of view being right rather than the Bible is right, and we want to pursue what the Bible has to say. And in other words, it was more about their interpretation than if you could make a biblical case for something that meant that it wasn't outside of orthodoxy. You know what I mean? So like what I'm explaining there is, like, I go to a church now, non-denominational, comes out of MacArthur's, John MacArthur's. A lot of all of our leadership in one form or fashion basically came out of John MacArthur's church. In fact, our pastor, it was the former college and career youth pastor for Grace out in LA.
Wow, cool.
So the mentality that at the church I go to now, they don't agree with preterism. I would also say, like, that's not a position that they hold as a doctrinal statement, but the tenor of the conversation is so much different, because I go to them and I say, hey, I'm thinking about this. I'm wrestling through it. The possibility of it being this being the case. Here's what I'm thinking. They listen to me and they're like, listen, you're not in heresy, but but don't expect like we would have you teach a class on Revelation or something, like, so I think they're sort of like respectful that I'm holding the Bible as supreme, excuse me, but I'm not, but they're also like, you have to be realistic. Our church that's not our position. So, be respectful of that. You know what I mean? And I'm totally cool with that too, because I'm not being run out of the church because of a disagreement, which I greatly appreciate. And so so I've had some really good conversations with them, and ultimately, I do a Bible study on Friday mornings with one of our deacons, and we're just reading through the book of reading through the entire Bible, and we've been reading one book at a time for the last 2.5 years. We've read 33 books so far, and we just finished Revelation a couple months ago. That was the last book we did before this one that we're on now, and we specifically were like, okay, Michael, you've got these questions, let's tackle them, and we went through the book of Revelation together, and in the position I landed on was like, I think preterism probably is more likely. And he was like, I'm okay with that as long as certain caveats come into play. And those were the
obvious ones.
Yeah, and those are the ones where I was like, yeah, I don't think that those are a problem here. So I'm with you. But someone asked full preterism or partial preterism. I guess they're asking, are we full, partial, full? I think that's part of what the point of the discussion is. what is maybe a biblical position on the issue?
Yeah. Well, I guess, I mean, my understanding is that I think you can go biblically. I think you can go pretty far into preterism.
I do too.
I think you can go pretty far, but I don't think you can go 100% of the way. I don't think you can go to like resurrection of the dead levels.
Yeah, I agree.
Doesn't seem to be the case. But in terms of like the end of the age, I think you can go that far. Even you can say the end of the age that Jesus was referring to, and that Paul was referring to. That was an age, and that ended.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. My feelings in reading through, and I shouldn't say feelings because that's awful. It's not about what I feel. It's what does the Bible say?
Postmodern.
Yeah, it's very postmodern. It's not about what I feel. It's about what do I think the Bible is saying. And I would admit that there is a potential awkward reading of especially 19 going into 20, chapters 19 going into 20. But the feeling I had coming away from it, having read through it and studied it, is I think the first 19 chapters are talking about events that were shortly to come to pass. And I think 20 through the remainder of the book are talking about ultimacies and final states. And so I'm pretty much in the camp that I think basically everything other than the actual second coming has happened. Sort of where I've landed on the issue. And I would say, and I would also say though, that I think a futurist perspective as well as a preterist perspective are both pretty biblical ones. I don't think a futurist perspective is inherently wrong and the preterist one is right, or vice versa. I think both are valid interpretations in a space where it's really hard for us to say with absolute definitiveness which one is right.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
And so I think it's just I'm more convinced of the preterist perspective for the first 19 chapters than I am of the futurist perspective. But I won't be offended if the other one is true. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so so I think there's probably value in sitting under teaching of both.
Yeah.
That's what I've walked away with.
Tricky. Yeah. I'm trying to.
But I guess the point would maybe be, I would imagine that anyone who's sort of listening to this most people would probably land more into knowing the traditional futurist perspective. And so there might be some people who don't even know what we're talking about or how it works or what the biblical case for it would be. So I don't know if you want to work through any of that at all.
Yeah. Well, okay. So you're saying chapter 19 is where it divides?
I think so. I think that the description of the second coming that's in 19, because that's essentially what we're kind of getting, is this idea of Christ in his second coming on a horse, all these sort of things. I think that's the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And I think that's just supposed to be the end of the age. And then 19 or then 20 is describing his final coming. Like I'm almost like a partial preterist premillennialist. Like it's like I've some I don't know. here's all I really do know is I think that there's far too many coincidences in the book of Revelation with things that actually happened in history to look at it and say, that's not what he's talking about. It's just really hard for me to do that. And specifically the idea of Nero being the Antichrist is where I'm really convinced that Nero was the Antichrist described, or was the beast of Revelation, I guess, is what I should specifically say.
Okay, so I've heard there's the number.
Mm-hmm.
There's the number of the beast thing, and then there's somewhere about the what is it? 6 kings, and one's currently sitting and one's about to sit.
Yep.
And that kind of lines up too with Nero, is my understanding. If you start with Augustus being like the first like proper Roman emperor.
Yep.
But what's the, because you hear like the 616 and you hear 666, which I didn't know until a couple years ago.
Yeah, it's pretty wild, isn't it?
Yeah, where do you are you able to parse that? Because I don't remember anything about the number thing. I just feel like that confuses me a lot.
Yeah, so someone's asking about multifaceted and long term, the idea of a prophecy, which would be like in some, which is called the I think traditionally it's called the historist version of the book of Revelation, which is that Revelation is continuously unfolding over the entirety of church history, meaning that some of it has happened, some of it is happening, and some of it will happen.
Yeah, sure.
We can certainly talk about that later. I don't think that's likely. Although interestingly enough, it's probably the more orthodox position on the issue, at least to a large degree. Yeah, that was probably the more historically held position. But it also, like, the marker is constantly moving. That's the problem. So
yeah.
But in answer to the question about the number, so you were just asking me to explain it, or?
Yeah, like what's, yeah, tell me your theory on the number thing in Nero.
Yeah, I'm probably just going to hold the same thing you were just pulling up, which is that that John is essentially talking in code.
Yeah.
That he knows that the believers of that time period are that the believers from that time period were being in the process of being persecuted. It's essentially like he doesn't want to just call Nero out as this mass murderer type figure, because that's not going to look good. So he's essentially writing in code, and in the language that he uses seems to even indicate that he's like, look, a person with understanding will know this number. It is the number of a man. Like he's trying to pay attention, you guys. And then but yeah, the kind of idea around this theory, for those who aren't familiar with it, is that the number 666 is actually I'm not sure what is it anagram, or it's like that basically the numbers 666, if you take the name Nero I think it's in the Aramaic and the Latin, right? Those were the two major translations of the time. And that the 666 discussion is, I think, the Aramaic translation, that basically the name Nero, if you take the letters, you assign them numerical value, they add up to 666. And then in the Latin translation, the same name in Latin, using the alphanumeric coding, becomes 616. So, and in the Latin translations of the book, I believe I'm getting my translations correct, that in the Latin translations of the book of Revelation, it says 616 instead of 666. But so that's the gist of it, is that that only seems to really further that argument, that's a strong possibility. If his name lines up with both in both translations, that's pretty awfully coincidental.
Yeah.
And then you just even then, the general description of what the book of Revelation is saying at that point, which is basically that this person's going to come into power. He's going to persecute the believers. You can't do trade in the region unless you have his name ascribed on your head and on your forehead. And essentially, people take that very literally, which seems foolish, given almost every other prophecy is not taken literally. But that essentially the idea is, or I think from what I understand is historically at the time, Nero basically did that, which was that the money, the only way to do trade in the region within that time period was if you had his seal on your trade. So in other words, you had to have the mark of the beast to do trade. So basically that's where they're coming at with it, is that basically 666 is the number of the beast describing Nero, and the descriptions of him around that area are just describing the way he was acting as the emperor for Rome, that he was persecuting the Christians at the time. He was controlling trade through his own mark. And then even more interesting along with that would be the idea that kind of it talks about two beasts at that time, right? You have the major beast and then its heads. And Nero is being described, the beast of Revelation is being described as one of those heads. Now, what's really interesting is it describes that beast, that head being struck down, and that the whole world marveled, right?
Yeah.
And so from what I understand historically, and I'm no historian, I'm just trying to recount everything I know. So anyone paying attention,
fantastic.
Please remember, anyone paying attention, I'm not a theologian. I'm just recounting how I'm understanding.
Those who want,
but that essentially what happened is when Nero killed himself, and he wounded his own head, and that's how he went down. And in the Book of Revelation says he was wounded in his head, right?
Yeah. He committed suicide. Yeah. Right.
And so the discussion, or sorry, what it also talks about in Revelation following this is that the whole world marveled that it was resurrected, right? And so essentially when Nero kills himself, the whole ancient world at that time began to question whether Rome was done, basically, and marveled that it somehow came through it. Is essentially the reading of what people are saying is going on here. Nero dies, he kills himself. The whole world thinks that's it for Rome. They're done. Because this was in the middle of the kind of when, I think this was during the period where they were kind of having successive emperors back to back to back. Like they were going through them really quick.
I think there were a couple that were just for a few months.
Right. So basically the idea being that the whole world began to suspect, oh crap, this is it. You know, like they're done. And then they seemingly rose from their own ashes. So when it talks about the beast being struck and then it rising again and the whole world marveling, that's what it's talking about, is that Nero killed himself. Everyone thought Rome was done with, and then he came back, and then Rome, rose again. Hey, Regan.
Regan, that's fantastic. That's more than I've ever heard. That's really good.
I have a great book that I recommend anybody who's interested in this topic pick up. It's called Revelation: 4 Views, Revised and Updated. And it looks at the 4 major interpretations of the book of Revelation, and it aligns commentary side by side.
Oh, that's great.
And so you can just look at the interpretations. You'll look at the historist view, which is the view that we're talking about, where Revelation is continuously unfolding throughout history. The futurist version, that it's not happened yet, and the preterist version that it has, and then also the literist version. I think it's literist. Idealist, which is the idea that it's all basically metaphor. That it's not supposed to be taken seriously.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's the way people should be looking into this, is hearing all sides.
Yeah, and that's what makes it a great thing to pick up, because it does give you every bit of perspective. And if anything, I have to be careful. When I get excited, I talk really loud, and my wife's like, "You're keeping the kids awake."
I know, same here. She's like, "You're keeping me awake."
All right, so I'll try to keep my tone down. But the first 60, I think it's 70 pages or so, the introduction is a fantastic thing alone, worth buying the book. It does a great job of explaining the history of the book, the different interpretations, like how do we arrive at the book? Who is the author? Is it definitely John? Is it somebody else? Like it basically opens the door to say, like, it could be it could be somebody else too, but here's the reasons why we think it was John. It's a great book to read. Just even that piece to get a better understanding of what it's talking, what the book of Revelation is talking about before you dive in.
Is that an older book?
It is.
I think I've heard. I think I watched like 90s, like someone had like converted like VCR tapes to YouTube clips of Sproul talking about things, and he was mentioning like the Four Views book, and I was like, oh, I should probably get that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good read. It's like $20 on Amazon. It's a nice thick book. It was such a helpful companion for my friend Vance and I who were reading through the Bible together, and just to have something that we could reference and just lay out the views and go like, what do we do with this? You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
That sounds good. Okay, so I have a friend named his moniker is Hound.
Mm-hmm.
We're using our legal names, and he is he's got some interesting takes on the there's like he likes reading as I like try to do, but he's like really good about this, reading like academic papers and stuff like this, Journal of Biblical Literature type stuff, and he there's like a liturgical framework to Revelation. That's like a layer to it that apparently is pretty helpful.
Okay.
If he comes in, we can hear that.
I saw Kelson joined as well.
Oh, good.
How's it going?
Hey, fellas.
Hey, there we go. That link finally worked. I'm sorry.
It's all good. So I have a question.
Jump in.
So Michael had listed the different schools of thought: futurism, idealism, all that. Is there a term for believing that the prophecies had both near and far-reaching implications? That something would happen in the near future as sort of a foreshadowing, and then it would come true in another sense farther in the future?
It's a good question. So basically, you want my honest answer on it? My honest answer would be that everybody I've heard use that argument are people trying to dodge how preterism makes too much sense.
Oh no!
It's basically that they can't deny that the Book of Revelation seems to point out a lot of things that have already happened, but they hold a futurist perspective, and they don't want to give that up. So they're basically saying, well, it's maybe going to happen 2 times.
Yeah, maybe
now, maybe. I don't think that's what John meant, because John basically says pretty implicitly, like, these are things that are about to happen. You know, he's like, this is on your doorstep. Pay attention, you know. So possibly, but I've never heard, basically what I'm saying is I'm not aware of like an actual school of theological thought along that, as much as it's the answer that I end up hearing when people can't reconcile a preterist viewpoint to a futurist viewpoint. That's usually when I hear it come up.
Where there's the pan millennials, right?
That's what my friend said. But
yeah,
he says, yeah, I'm a panelist. It's all going to pan out.
Yeah, it all pans out in the end.
Which is true.
It's true.
It's true.
And we're all saying that at the end of the day.
But like, there's a great discussion with John Piper and Douglas Wilson and a couple other guys on YouTube called A Night of Eschatology. It's like a 2.5-hour discussion on just different viewpoints, particularly around the millennium, rather than dealing with all this other stuff. But what's so great at it is, I think it's Doug Wilson at the end really hammers down. He's like, listen, God gave us this book for a reason. Like, he wants us to understand it. He wants us to wrestle with it. And we should all become convinced in our own mind of what we think it's saying. Like, that's not a wasted effort. And I think the sin I've lived with for far too long is I was too intimidated by this book to like actually spend the time and just say like, hey, I want to know what I think it's talking about, you know? So I've tried to just get out of my skin where I just think Left Behind is the answer. I've actually heard Tim LaHaye preach in person on the Book of Revelation, but he completely lost me when he described something in Revelation as being Black Hawk helicopters, and I was like, all right, I'm out.
Oh no.
I was like, I'm done. You've lost me, man. You've lost me.
Hey, Hound. How you doing?
How's it going?
Decent.
Oh man, I'm excited about what you want to throw down. You mentioned this before. I've never heard it explained.
Like it's not much because I can't like bring all the relevant stuff I've read to mind in like one fell swoop.
Yeah.
But there are like some very clear references within the Book of Revelation to Second Temple liturgical rituals, and some scholars have linked it to like things that occur within Revelation to early church liturgy. But so like one of the big examples. This was actually by. Have you seen Brack on Discord?
Mm-mm.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
What is he? Is he wanting to? What's he saying?
He's around, but
yeah. I see him. Yep. Mm-hmm.
He's actually Jewish, and he studied for a bit on Jewish liturgy.
Oh, cool.
So he actually brought up like one thing because he's so familiar with it, which is that the opening of the scroll.
Mm-hmm.
It's like
from Daniel. I would
pretty point on point the sort of liturgy of the word within Judaism of the time, even sort of continuing now in various Christian traditions and Judaism. But you'd have like the one person who was worthy to read the scroll, and that's like the cantor, who sort of knows the proper way to read the scroll liturgically. And then you have the prostration, and prostration was actually pretty big in liturgical scheme in that time, even though it died out later on. And so there's all these different points like this, and like a few different scholars have like noticed it.
Yeah, I was reading somewhere about how I think in modern day rabbinic Judaism, the head rabbi reads the first section of Torah, and but before, I think maybe even in early, it's probably before rabbinic Judaism, they were it'd have to be a Levite first to do the first Torah reading, but there'd be like 5 or 6 Torah readings throughout the liturgical service. So I guess that's.
No, I mean, it fits for sort of the sort of priestly overtones for the elders, and then on top of that, Christ as high priest and stuff.
Yeah, Regan's an Orthodox Christian. He's in the Orthodox Church. He's saying they still use cantors and designated readers and prostrations.
Yeah, those Ortho bros, they're up to some good stuff. Watching them on Twitter, I'm fairly impressed.
Hank, always bring him in here if he wants to offer up some opinions on it as well.
Reagan, do you want to throw in your Eastern perspective? You only got one half of the planet represented right now.
Right. But, kind of on the things I've noticed in reading Revelation that is really interesting to me is a futurist perspective in a lot of ways ends up reading the book as a very linear progression of events, right? And really, I think if you're, and I hesitate to use this because I think it basically makes me sound like I'm saying very educated scholars are missing the boat, and I don't think that's the case. But it really seems like the book moves, it explains the same 3 events 3 different times. And it's from like a zoomed out perspective, a zoomed in perspective, and another zoomed in perspective. And it constantly refers to events coming back and forth. So like they'll look at the scroll, the seal judgments, the bowl judgments, all these things, as if they're successive events that one's happening the other. And it really more reads like they're kind of happening on top of each other in different moments. But I think when you just look at the evidence that it points towards the destruction of the temple in AD 70, the Jewish Roman war, I don't know, man. It feels very, very hard to say that that's not what it's talking about. I guess if you take everything it says and you're like, well, it literally says 1/3 of the oceans turned to blood, and it's like, okay, well, the Bible uses a lot of language like that to describe things that, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, like where is it? Isaiah talking about the fall of Babylon.
Yeah.
Is, I you know, pretty like dramatically similar language to an event that we all agree has already happened.
Mm-hmm.
And just to use that like celestial apocalyptic language, I guess, to like the stars falling from heaven and
right,
mountains
and
falling
it's
over.
just,
Yeah,
and I think it's describing an awful war
yeah,
in descriptive language. And that's not to say that I don't think it does tie into a few things. One of the interesting things in the commentary, it sort of looks at some accountings of Josephus at the time when it's describing like the waters turning to blood and all that sort of thing, that this was apparently, I could look it up, the specific reference, but apparently a naval war between the Jews and Rome around that time, where basically the waters were filled with bodies, you know. That, and the sort of descriptions that Josephus uses of the city Jerusalem during the middle of this war, because from what I understand, basically at the time the Romans cut Jerusalem off from everything basically, and they were like eating each other. Like Josephus is describing people eating each other, and all these sort of crazy things. And when you read in the book of Luke, when he's talking about this, when he's sort of saying like, when he's describing the judgment that's coming, it echoes a lot of what kind of Josephus describes as happening. This sort of like wailing and desperation and wishing that they were dead and like just all this crazy stuff. And so I think the thing that makes prayerism uncomfortable for a lot of folks, one is I think it means that the book of Revelation is talking in very harsh terms about Israel. Because it almost makes the reading of any time it's talking about Babylon, almost every time it's actually talking about Jerusalem and talking about Israel and sort of their rejection of the Messiah. And I think a lot of Christians don't want to put down the Jews, and because, you know, that's God's chosen people. And I don't think that's the position you have to take. I think if God's judging the Jews for what they did, he's judging the Jews for what they did. But I think that's probably where some of that uncomfortability comes from, would be my guess. Is it does seem to talk. It basically says, like, to some degree, it's like Jesus is done with Israel, but we know that that's not the case, you know.
Yeah. What's the well, I'll say that in a little bit, but one thing that I think is interesting about, I don't think this is in Josephus, but the some like early Christian chronicler pointing out that Christians, when they saw the like in Jerusalem and in the area, instead of in Judah, like going to the biggest stronghold, which was the Jerusalem kind of fortifications when the Romans were coming, the Christians, because of Revelation, or more particularly because of Matthew, is it 19 or, you know, the I forgot the term for it, but where he's talking about like the last days, and when you see these things happen, run to the mountains.
Yeah.
You know, hope that you're not in labor, you know, or that it's the Sabbath, but just get out. The Christians understood that as, I mean, they were expecting it to happen in their lifetime, and it did, because they got out.
Right.
And thankfully, at least some people got out.
Right.
It was according to Josephus, it's like 100,000 people or something died.
Yeah.
Because the whole region, you know, jumped into the castle of Jerusalem, basically, which seemed like a sensible, you know, in normal situations, you think that's the most reasonable thing to do, especially if you don't want to see, by any means, you don't want to see the temple destroyed.
Right.
But, yeah.
It's rough stuff.
Yeah.
To me, it makes the book of Revelation that much, I don't know. I hate using the words, to me, and I don't care what I think. I want to know what the truth is, you know. But the preterist interpretation on it that I think resonates the most for me is it just makes a lot of sense, for one. And I think it's funny how we, in any other letter of the Bible, you know, any of the epistles or whatever, we're always like, what's the context? What is he saying? Let's look at the introduction. We take that to mean something. Revelation literally starts off with this, you know, these are events that are about to happen. And we're all like, oh, so 2,000 years from now?
Yeah.
It's like, no, they're about to happen. And you were bringing up, I'm sorry, Hound, you were bringing up the you know, talking about the scroll. What's interesting about that is I think that scroll that's being described is actually the scroll from Daniel. Because in the book of Daniel, he says, seal the scroll and no one can open it, basically. No one is worthy to open this. And then Jesus shows up in this vision and the scroll is brought before him and he's worthy. And that basically this was the prophecy that was sealed up in Daniel until the right time. And gosh, I'm losing my train of thought with it. But then at the end of the book of Revelation, John goes out of his way to say, don't seal this book up. So the idea in Daniel is that this is not for now, this is for way later. And then in Revelation, you see the scrolls open, all the events happen, but John doesn't say seal the scroll, he says leave it open. You know, these events are happening. This is about to occur. Yeah. So the only thing that ends up becoming potentially problematic with that is whether the full preterist perspective has to be assumed at that point, because if that's the case, then that, you know, creates some issues. Go ahead.
He actually is told not to write down what the 7 thunders are, though.
One thing that bothers me is just when scholars go at Revelation, but it's like completely disconnected from like the wider sort of context and literary context. I mean, if you're not reading apocalyptic literature, if you're not like steeped in Second Temple Judaism, I don't think you should be allowed within 100 feet of the Book of Revelation.
Yeah.
What do you think that changes about, like, with your kind of knowledge on that? I'm assuming you spend some time in it. How do you think that changes the reading of it?
Well, for me, I tend to be sort of an eschatological agnostic for most of it. But there are some certain passages which, when you look at them and you're aware of some of the stuff, you get things out of them that you wouldn't normally get. Like, is it Revelation 21:1? The new heaven, new earth?
I don't know. Can look it up.
Let's see.
Around there.
Let's see.
Yeah.
So this verse has like this really odd throwaway line, which in the minds of like these ultra literalists gets like totally goes really weird places, which is, and there was no more sea. And so I think Matt knows where I'm going with.
Land the plane.
So the sea is like this. It's this big ancient Near Eastern motif that like reoccurs throughout the biblical text as either chaos or death or the forces of darkness, etc. And even in like the previous verses, you get the sea giving up its dead, which is like just a couple verses before the beginning of the next chapter.
Yeah.
Or like. And if you look at it carefully, it's almost a chiasm where you have the sea gives up its dead, death and Hades give up the dead that are in them, death and Hades cast into the lake of fire, there is no more sea. And you get like, but you might not even know to look for this if you're not like familiar as the sea as the underworld motif, or the sea as chaos motif throughout the ancient world and further than that in the biblical text.
Mm-hmm.
Or Revelation 12. Revelation 12 is like this weird passage. Got this 12-headed dragon. Who knows what's up with that?
Mm-hmm.
If you're clued in, you know what 12-headed dragon means. You know that Litanu is the tyrant with 7 heads. It's the great chaos dragon. And then when you look closer, you notice like the words Drakon and Ophius, dragon and serpent, that are just paired like 2 or 3 times throughout the text when referring to Satan. Actually, in the Septuagint version of Isaiah, what's the verse? Where it's like, in that day, I'll slay the twisting serpent, the fleeing serpent.
Yes, with that weird phraseology.
Leviathan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that weird phraseology with like the word, which is like I think it's either fleeing or twisting, which is it never occurs anywhere else throughout the Hebrew scripture.
Yeah.
It's actually a cognate for the word which occurs in the Ugaritic text. Like both fleeing and twisting have like very near linguistic parallels in the Ugaritic text, which talks about the fleeing serpent, the twisting serpent, and it's also Leviathan.
Interesting.
And so,
were you ready for that, Mike?
No.
Yeah. And you never actually get like 12 heads in the Hebrew scripture. You do have Leviathan as referred to as having multiple heads, but you never get an exact number. But when you know that Leviathan is often seen as having 12 heads in like the thing, they're like, oh, this is Satan. He's being depicted as Leviathan. Leviathan is the creature of chaos.
Yeah.
Satan is being depicted as the force of chaos. This is.
Yeah. And this is all imagery that would be. It's always frustrating because the stuff that the Bible belabors is the stuff that we tend to talk about more because I don't know. At least we like to think that we understand those things better because there's more, more ink was spilt to explain it. And then the stuff that the Bible takes for granted that it's, that its immediate readers would understand and catch the literary allusions to and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Like we have to, yeah.
What? So you're talking about a 12-headed dragon in Revelation? There's the 7-headed one. Is that what we're talking about?
For 7 heads, yeah.
7 heads, 12 crowns.
I don't know why I said 12.
Okay, I was like, which one are we talking about?
Thank you. I was wondering about that as well.
I'm like, well,
Sorry.
it's okay. And the preterist interpretation of that ends up being it's the 7 corners of the Roman Empire, basically.
Yeah.
That's the description of it.
That
but
could have something to do with it, but also it's Leviathan with 7 heads.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's
the basic reading.
Yeah. That's what's neat about it. That's what makes it like a literary. I mean, it's a masterpiece.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's inspired. It's a vision, but it's prophecy and it's a masterpiece, which is really.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
he's often doing like multiple things.
Yeah.
The thing I always try to be careful with this stuff, like I think it's endlessly fascinating to discuss it, but I'm like, man, like the Jews were expecting, like, as a Christian, the Jews were expecting a Messiah. And a lot of them were steeped in the prophecy surrounding the Messiah. And then Jesus showed up, and none of them could recognize him. Yeah. And they couldn't draw the same conclusions with the book and be able to understand, or with the prophecies, and go like, oh, this is the guy. Now, I think a big part of that's providential because that was the prophecy that they would reject him. But I've always tried to be careful with it, and just to say like, man, we could just really get a lot of this wrong, which is where I sympathize with the panmillennial folks, or they're like, I don't know, it's all going to pan out. Yeah. But I don't think, but I do think there is a level of revelation where it is supposed to have a practical application. And I think that's why John is explicit about it having a practical application to them. And I think we lose that with futurist interpretation. I don't know how that goes into the stuff you're talking about, Hound, but that's my only. I think that's the biggest thing I've taken away with in my studying and looking at the preterist perspective is it becomes a way more practical book, and a way more near warning to the church, and also like you and I were talking about, Matt, becomes encouraging because then we actually can see that God fulfilled His purposes in the end, and it came through. We can look at the book of Revelation. Yeah. We can look at it and say it's a true book. It happened, you know.
So I'll say one more thing, and then I've actually got to bounce.
Yeah.
It's interesting when you talked about, you know, people being uncomfortable with this.
Mm-hmm.
So here's the thing for me. I don't necessarily agree with the idea of it because I feel like there's too much, particularly among the trumpets and the vials, that just needs to be explained away as metaphor. So by my personal beliefs, I don't agree. Here's the thing. I'm not uncomfortable hearing it. And you know, the nature of being uncomfortable. I mean, I've heard the Adventist theories on the millennium and things like that. I was like, okay, some of that I could see. You know, maybe the seals happened, or the first 4, maybe 5 seals happened progressively over several centuries. Maybe not. Here's the thing. I keep a pretty open mind with that stuff because I realize not everybody gets. Nobody gets everything. God doesn't reveal the truth to everyone.
Right.
So at the same time, I mean, there are things that I do believe. There are things that I'm kind of, okay, well, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. I don't really know. I choose to think it's this. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. And I'm secure in that. And to be uncomfortable with a belief system or a theory that flies in the face of what you believe indicates an insecurity in your own beliefs.
Yeah.
Well, I think people are in general very sensitive to the idea of potential anti-Semitism, and the idea that God is sort of done with Israel strikes into that sort of that sensitivity. That's the impression I get from folks who get really uncomfortable with it, and I'd have to really unpack it. It's been a couple months since I really dove into all this with my friend, but he was one of the people who was particularly just like, God's not done with Israel, and I'm like, I'm not saying he is, but he seems to be having some pretty harsh language about the situation and where they found themselves in and their judgment. And
I mean, you know, personally for me, I believe more judgment is coming to Israel. There is, I look at Israel 2 ways. There is the state of Israel, which is a secular state. And then there is the remnant of Israel. And I believe the state of Israel will face judgment largely at the hands of the rest of the world. And it is the remnant that will be saved.
You're talking about the 144,000 particularly, or in this context, or something different?
No. Forget which it is, but I know there's one, I believe it's among the trumpets, where the majority of Jerusalem gets destroyed by an earthquake. Split into 3.
I'm not sure off the top of my head either.
I've got something that ties into this whole what does God have to do with, what is he, what are his plans remaining for Israel? It's a paper from some guy named Jason Staples. Never heard of him. He's like a UNC Chapel Hill professor.
Name sounds familiar, but
yeah. He wrote something on so in Romans 11, where it says there's a partial hardening has come upon part of Israel until the fullness of the nations has come in, and thus all Israel will be saved. Everyone's got an opinion on that part. This guy has the insight, and he convinced me with this paper. He has the insight to point to the hardening. Let's see, what's the phrasing? the fullness of the nations, and then the concepts of what all Israel versus a part of Israel means. And in the Greek, I guess, it becomes clear, this is his argument at least, is that oftentimes when talking about Judea and ethnic Israel post return from exile, it'd be more like using the language of just talking about Judean Jews, I guess. You'd say something, you'd say the Jews. And then if you're talking about Israel, basically pre-exile, pre-northern Assyrian exile, you would say the Bible talks about Israel, and they're talking about all the nations of Israel, the 12 tribes, and that's a singular unit. But then post northern exile, it's talking about the I'm doing a really bad job.
It's all right. This is a complicated topic, man. It's hard to.
Yeah.
And you always have to be careful because you're like, I could trip over the details and just completely miss it.
3 times.
I'm with you, man. I understand.
But like, long story short, like his view is that the promise to Ephraim and Manasseh, that's where that phrase of the fullness of the Gentiles, it's only said twice in the Bible. It's once in Romans 11, and then it's also in Genesis. And so the idea is that Paul is keying into this idea that the when Judah blesses Ephraim, he says that Ephraim, the younger, will be the greater nations will come from him, and in him the fullness of the Gentiles will be blessed. And so the idea is that, and I guess this is a Second Temple idea generally, that after the northern exile, the 10 tribes, the quote unquote lost 10 tribes, the tribes that never came back after exile, they're identified with the nations generally because they were dispersed among the nations. Like, that's the biblical language. So when when Paul talks about proclaiming the gospel to the Gentiles, he's identifying that with the return of the northern kingdom, Ephraim. So believers from among the nations are being identified with prophecy to Ephraim, which is a way of saying, just like in James, at the beginning of James, it says like to the 12 tribes in the diaspora. And some people think like, oh, I guess he's only writing to ethnic Jews. But from this idea, he's writing to all the believers of all, from all ethnic identities who are in Abraham, in receiving the covenant blessings from Judah, like being, grafted into the same tree as Israel.
Yeah.
But in faith, So they're just in talking about Ephraim and Manasseh was a common Second Temple way of identifying ethnic Jews in Manasseh, and then talking about believers from diaspora, whether or not they were ethnically related or not. You had a valid way to talk about them as being descendants of Ephraim, quote unquote, and that's what Paul's keying into in Romans 11. So
well, I think that's basically what the heart of Romans 9 is too, is that he's sort of chastising them for basically thinking they deserve it, nobody else does.
Yeah.
I know it's a major reform chapter for people who look at it for predestination. I don't deny that that's a big part of what I think it's talking about. But I think the point of what Paul is trying to drive at is like, what right do you have to say you have any right to an inheritance? It was given to you. You didn't do anything. And then sort of saying, if God wants to bring in and graft in another branch to this tree, that's his prerogative, But
I forget who it was who said it, but they said, God could raise up sons of Abraham from these stones.
Right. I was actually about to talk about that. I think in general,
sounds like Jesus.
Yeah, I think he definitely says that. But I can't remember the exact passage, but yes. But I think in general, one of the things we lose track of a lot is that ultimately God certainly has an interest in the political things that happen in the nations and that sort of thing, but he's way more interested in what's going on in the heart and how that's impacting people. And like that, the true, like what he's basically saying there is like, I don't care if you're born from this region, if I can make sons of Abraham from wherever I want to make them. And so in other words, he's caring about the heart of the issue. Isaiah 1 dealing with the same type of issue. And so I think we just have to be careful when we're looking at that sort of thing. Like the church is the true Israel in some respect. You know what I mean? So what do you do with that? Like, when you're talking about, is he done with Israel? I don't know. Maybe he is done with the region, but he's not. But Israel is really the heart, I guess. I don't know. That's where I'm out of my pay grade when it comes to theology.
See, I would actually argue that the fact that they, after almost 2 millennia of exile, they ended up back in the land is pretty much living proof that he's not done with them by his sight.
That they maintained a ethnic identity, I guess. That's compelling.
And resurrected a thought to be dead language. That is no small task.
And I'll be honest, I don't hold the position I think he's done with them. I think the prophecies that you see where it seems to indicate that Christ will sit on a literal throne of David, like it's not a metaphorical one in heaven. I think that's, I think he's not done,
Oh, interesting.
It's, I think it's in the book of, what is it? It's one of the minor prophets that deals with it. And it's sort of, you get this prophetic vision of Christ. It's sort of weird. It's like the whole book kind of jumps back and forth in past and present. Like it goes all over the place. But I do think he will occupy a literal throne. And that's where I struggle with these two interpretations, because I don't disagree with the premillennial viewpoint of an actual kingdom on earth. But I also see the preterist perspective making a ton of sense with regards to the majority of the book. And that's where I struggle with trying to reconcile the two.
Yeah, you're an interesting hybrid there.
Well, because I don't think he's being metaphorical when he's talking about the Messiah sitting on the throne of David. I don't think that's a metaphor. I think he's being literal.
I think you say John MacArthur holds that view too.
Yeah, I would be shocked if he doesn't. Yeah. He's a pre-mill futurist, and I'm almost positive of it.
Yeah.
So, as much as I am enjoying this, because it's very engaging, it's good to hear different ideas. I have got to call it a night, fellas.
Yeah, man, it's nice to meet you.
Yeah. Great.
You too.
I'm glad you were able to come in, and sorry again. Next time I'll have this set up for you before I press play.
So it's all good. We'll probably pick it up Tuesday or whatever. Same time, same channel. All right, Alan, good to meet you as well. Michael,
You too.
Man, have a good night.
all right, you too.
I'll probably be heading out somewhat shortly myself, but
Yeah, we can wrap it up. It's such an interesting topic. I was listening to a lot of stuff for the past couple days, trying to get my head around it, and realizing that couple days is not enough time to get around.
I think for me, the things that convince me a lot are some of the stuff we talked about. Like the beast being Nero is just like, man, that's a lot of coincidences that seem to line up. And I don't know if you have a perspective on that, but those few chapters, and then how it echoes back later, I think in Revelation 19, where it talks about the 7 emperors of Rome with Nero's the 6th, right? At that time, and it just sort of lining up with all that and talking about the next one will be here for a little while, and he was only around for 6 months, and it's just like, man, it lines up a lot with the history of it, with what was going on in the region. It makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, for me, I just stick with what I know, because I know if I get into the whole eschatological aspect, everything goes screwy fast.
That is fair. But I'll say this: it's been spending the time I've spent on it, like I can't say that I 100% know where I land. I think I'm more in the preterist camp than I am in the futurist one overall, as far as being convinced. But I certainly have found it to be like well worth my time. Like it's made me have such an appreciation for this book that I've generally tried to steer clear of because I didn't know how to handle it, you know. And because I was like, what we're all just going to argue about stuff. Like, what's the practical application? And really, it's just Jesus is going to preserve his church. He's going to take care of us. He's going to.
I think actually De Silva has some interesting stuff to say on, like, even more immediate practical application. I think.
Who's this?
David De Silva.
David who? I'm sorry, I didn't hear. De Silva. Okay.
He's a big academic on these things.
Okay.
New Testament.
I'll have to check him out.
They're very, very good in like the 2nd century Mediterranean Greco-Roman context stuff. Like his work on is a different book, but his work on I think it's Honor, Kinship, Patronage, and Purity, or some rearrangement of that. I can never remember the title exactly. Is like it's like a must read for New Testament studies.
Interesting.
Yeah, kind of redefined. I mean, it did redefine my how I use language. Like you just throw around words like grace. I think I'm still Reformed, but I can't use those words the way Reformers use as much as
Interesting.
Someone's got to speak.
You got an echo chamber going on.
Can I see your Moses before we wrap up?
Yeah,
that's pretty cool.
Working on it here. I'm very intrigued to see what the elders and all think of my inclusion of the 10 Commandments in Hebrew as opposed to English. But
I hope they like it.
I'm sure they probably our elders tend to be in the camp that I would be shocked if they were like, don't do that. And if anything, they might say, could we make it English just so people, can read it? But I think they would probably end up appreciating the effort nonetheless.
Middle Eastern taste, so there's that.
I mean, I prefer like some horns and some shiny, blinding countenance. But other than that, cool.
Yeah, I don't. These portraits I've been doing have been an interesting sort of challenge. Like basically what we're trying to do is capture. You do a portrait of a person from the Bible, and then put some sort of event or a hint of something from their life along with it. And I just tried to do the burning bush and then him, but I can make his face shiny. I can do that.
Yeah, man.
It's not done yet. No, I'll show you the.
I think they're actually statues of Moses with horns.
Oh yeah, Michelangelo did one, I think.
What?
What's the horns reference? I don't know that I.
Okay, so it goes all the way back into sort of ancient Near Eastern depictions of divinity, and you get like this wording which can either denote like either shining countenance or horns, and they're both like sort of depictions of sort of a divine aspect to a person.
So is the potential idea that he didn't have a shining countenance, but he came down with horns? Like it's a potential mix-up
it's
of
like the words are like similar or something.
I got you.
So like in one text it got actually translated as horns, but
interesting.
Like Amar Honest did like a whole paper on like the similarity between the two. But yeah, it was probably the shining countenance, but the horns thing is just like this sort of interesting motif which stretches further back.
Yeah, I can see that generally in Ugaritic and stuff.
Oh yeah, like the horns are the symbol of power.
Like every deity has horns. So if he comes down in power, with a capital P, if you're going to write that in a book and you're going to explain like visually what happened when he came back down. I think using that kind of language.
I think even in like the Dead Sea Scrolls, like some of the exorcistic stuff is either we're talking to like the Watchers or the Nephilim, and saying that their horns are illusory horns. Their horns aren't really real.
Dude,
that's interesting.
Genesis 6 is my other massive obsession.
Same here.
Oh man,
that's how we talk.
We could have some talks about that.
Okay, we're gonna do that sometime. That's
oh yeah.
So what really is someone take their headphones off for that? I'm getting so much echo.
Yeah, Hound, put in your headset.
Don't really have one at the moment.
That's all right. What's shocking to me about the Genesis 6 thing is basically, you know, when you look at the book of Jude and how the book of Enoch sort of seems to draw a line back through all these events, right? And talking to people in the Reformed side of the Protestant faith, like meaning the Calvinistic side, like agreeing with that essentially like it was a plot by Satan and demons to keep to usurp the bloodline of Christ. I'm like, this is a real conversation I'm having with you people. Like that you guys believe that that's the case. And like, yeah, I'm like, what, why are we not talking about this? This is some sci-fi crazy stuff.
Like there's like actually an article called Demon Semen that's like an actual academic.
Yeah.
It's actually talking about Calvin and Luther's rejection of the divine view of Genesis 6, and how I think the author's Lutheran. He's like, we should really be re-examining this. But it's just a hilarious title.
I just couldn't believe that, because those were things that like I would hear on like the Mysterious Universe and Coast to Coast AM, where people were like, you know, expounding, and then to like have it be like, no, yeah, that's like a legitimate interpretation of what is going on there, you know.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, that's really interesting. I actually just finished reading 2 Samuel this past week, and it's interesting. At the end of that book, it talks about David slaying giants, like along the same line of Goliath, and that they had 6 fingers, 6 toes. And there, I guess, have been archaeological digs in and around northern part of the United States where they're digging up skeletons like that.
Okay, that's the whole archaeological stuff is like much less. Like we've been in this for a while, Matt and myself. The archaeological stuff is kind of really, really iffy.
Well, it definitely digs into conspiracy.
Sure. Very much so. Like there's this weird line in the Genesis 6 community. You get like on the one side you have like the high tier scholars like Heiser and Amaranis, and on the other side you have the weird, crazy Nephilim hunters.
Yeah, like, and we're both saying it's real, I guess, but we're saying, yeah, like what imagery is being drawn on what layer is this real? I guess what layer of reality? I guess.
Well, and there's also potential that what Genesis 6 is describing when it talks about the Nephilim, they're not actually talking about giants, because it's sort of 2 separate thoughts. Because he's like, this happened. Also, there were giants in those days. You know, we may be making an unfair comparison that they're one and the same. Essentially.
I mean, I think when you get to the conquest narrative, it makes much more sense to say that the giants are part of this, and especially when we get into, like, again, you pointed to Jude, and Jude repeated reference to the first Enoch tradition, and first Enoch, there's sort of exegesis of the whole thing is here: giants, angels. That's it.
Yeah, that's another example where the author is assuming that, and probably rightly so, I'm sure that the original readers and hearers of that letter would understand where he's dragging. And
yeah, because it's got like like some people only think it quotes the book of First Enoch once. There's actually like 3 or 4 more indirect allusions to it.
I've had discussions with friends of mine where I'm like, man, for a book that's not included in canon, it sure gets referenced a lot. I mean, I'm not saying it needs to be included in canon, but the fact that it's probably worthwhile reading for every Christian. It's just worth spending some time in it, because if I'm not incorrect there, I think even Christ references it at one point.
Probably a couple times.
Yeah, so it's definitely a book that holds some value in the tradition that's a little bit more esteemed than even like some of the books that the Old Testament references were, like, and some of these other events that they did were in this book. And okay, but Enoch gets referenced a lot as being something that seems to have been a pretty important event.
Yeah. I think at this point, like it has to be a part of our conversation, and maybe I would say even a part of our worldview on some level. If we're gonna understand, like it's not 15, 17 anymore. Like there's a lot more scholarship that's
right.
We've like translated so many stuff from the ancient Near East that kind of contextualizes it more.
The bigger question, though, is how you have Genesis 6, where it talks about people, this is what happened. And then it says giants existed in those days and also after. That creates a problem with the everybody died, but the family that's on a boat. So it's like, well, wait a minute. If they're all dead, why does it say they were there after?
People have been dealing with that question for a while.
Yeah,
like
it can be translated that they existed whenever these things occurred. I've heard that.
But you have when the Jews go into the Promised Land.
Yeah,
it talking about giants existing in like it seems like it's referencing the same thing. That these are related to that. Basically.
Yeah, you even have like Jewish interpreters trying to figure this out. Like there's different suggestions. Like, was one of Noah's son's wife a giant? Or there's a whole text devoted to Noah not being a giant. Like you have Noah's dad talking to Noah's mom, and it's like, well, this kid's like pretty good looking. He's pretty. Are you sure it's my kid? Nah. You remember that one night we did it? That's what had happened. I've not been keeping up with these weird angel dudes.
Right. It's just super interesting with that. What how that's going on. Same thing, like where in the beginning of Genesis, the fall happens. Then Cain kills Abel, leaves, and he just goes and settles in some other village that we're all supposed to not believe existed.
He builds a city.
Yeah. Well,
like, okay. And why does he need to be protected?
Yeah, he's fearful of all these other people. And I've been listening some to John Walton, I think.
Oh yeah.
And his kind of thoughts on the beginning of Genesis is pretty interesting. I don't know that I completely agree with them, but it's certainly an interesting way of looking at the book.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately a part of the issue is, I think some others have talked about it too, is that we read the book of Genesis as if it has to be literal history, and it's not interested in having a different conversation, or that it has to be scientific. I do think it's supposed to be intended as history, but but is it a science textbook? Or does it have a message that it's also trying to convey? So, but I don't know, and then if you get into the whole editor theory, then it becomes a lot more convoluted and all over the place. So, but it's really fascinating stuff. But like Genesis 1-6 is probably the thing I'm most obsessed with. Like, this is a whole different world. What is going on here? It's all over the place.
Yeah. That was a different age. What some epistle talks about the age that was before this one, referring to that time, and
it's like, is this Lord of the Rings? Is this when that happened?
Oh my gosh! Yeah. All right, we're gonna chat about Genesis 1-6 sometime.
Great, man. Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's super fascinating. My first graphic novel series was actually really heavily tied into it.
Really?
And I ended up abandoning the graphic novel. But
Oh.
I would also say, though, that the Adamsville plays in the same playground. And if I were to eventually like expand it out, the ending of book 3 of Adamsville like dips the toe in that water.
Yeah.
That I was intending to link my first graphic novel series with this graphic novel series, and like it's a broader mythology where I wanted to have some fun with everything going on in the first 6 chapters of Genesis. So,
are you serious? Like you zoomed out enough, and you'd see Nephilim and stuff.
Yeah,
that's awesome. Oh my gosh,
that's where I want to go. Maybe we'll see.
Yeah, it's too much fertile ground to not go there. Like once you hear this stuff, it's it captures the mind.
I'm always just cautious with that sort of thing, especially when I'm creating fiction, though, because I know on one hand it is fiction, but I hate bad religious fiction that sort of misleads people or takes people in the wrong direction, and so I try to. Yeah. I'm really trying to be like, this is science fiction, you guys. Like, we're having fun. Like, let's go have fun. Let's not be too literal here. So trying to find a way to like get as much knowledge as I can without like spending my entire life on it, to go like, how could I be true to this, but also have some, to kind of some traditional views on this and have some fun with it as well. We'll see if it ever happens.
Yeah, that's always an issue. Like sometimes, like do I want to like play the whole God and angels things straight up, or do I want to go more Tolkien-esque and create a new mythology loosely based on it?
It's what made the Noah movie from Darren Aronofsky so frustrating.
Let's not even talk about that. That is like.
Well, most people like me, like I'd never even heard of that at the time that I saw that. None of this First Enoch stuff had ever crossed my mind. So I was so confused. I thought he invented it just for the movie.
Oh gosh, I was so excited. I was like, he included giants, and then I'm watching, and I'm like, what did you do, dude?
Yeah, he definitely invented a lot.
Yeah, I'm like, I've never understood why Hollywood thinks it's necessary to destroy the scripture and their attempts to adapt it. I'm like, you look at the Passion of the Christ. I'll go on this point, then I got to wind down. But you look at the Passion of the Christ movie Mel Gibson made. I mean, say what you want about his character. I think he approached making the movie with a reverence towards the Bible, that he wanted to do his best to accurately represent it as he could. And it was a massive box office success because a lot of people are Christians. Like, but then you get stuff like dang it, Ridley Scott does the Exodus, gods and sons, what the heck, I can't remember, the gods and men or whatever the heck it was. He's such a talented director, and he just botches this, not only a story that like is important to the Christian faith, but like the Jewish faith, another huge section of the population. Like, why can't you, if you just accurately present it and do it well, people will come. Just do it right, man.
Yeah. Why are you squeamish with something that you're spending millions of dollars producing? Like, because don't even go there if you're going to get weirded out by it.
Well, they want to put their own spin on it, and I guess that's fine, but
yeah, sure.
Like, if you're trying to make money, just represent it accurately, do a good job with it, and people will show up. I was so bummed out by the Exodus, because the Exodus is probably my favorite just narrative of Scripture. It's so overwhelming. Like, you just watch this crazy thing happen. It's so cool. Like, just seeing how God intervenes to preserve a people. It's amazing. And I'm like, it's epic enough as it is. Why are you screwing with it?
Yeah.
Just accurately do it, man.
Just stick with Prince of Egypt.
Prince of Egypt is pretty darn good. It takes some liberties, but nothing too crazy.
Yeah, well, it's like the one from the 50s. I feel like thematically it works, you know, like the heartbeat feels the same.
Yeah.
And so I give it more creative latitude, I guess.
Although the more I've read the book of Exodus, and it's particularly the Exodus story, the more I get frustrated by the fact that they always turn Moses into like a superhero. And I'm like, meanwhile, when he's talking to the bush, he's like, I can't even talk. I need someone to go with me, you know? And so basically he's not like some bold, it doesn't appear anyway that he's a very bold, and he was just willing. And he had to have his brother go with him, or his brother, Aaron's his brother-in-law, right?
Yeah.
He has to have him go with him just to speak on his behalf, basically. And so I'm always like, it'd be nice to see an accurate representation of him as well. Anyway, that's minor mincing words, I guess. But
that's a good point.
I know I'm probably getting too literal with it, but I'm like, come on, man.
Yeah. Well, so long as they always keep the "you were my brother," like, which is not in the biblical text, but I just love the, we were raised by this, these you don't know these people, like these are my people, like, and let them go. Like, as long as you do that, I'm okay.
Right.
Even though it's entirely just a Hollywood fiction.
In a weird way, it's actually the Prince of Egypt movie that really spurred me on towards like taking my faith seriously. Not because the movie itself, but I had seen the movie. I liked the movie.
Yeah.
And I was talking with a girl in high school, and she and I were talking about it. And she was talking about these sort of inconsistencies or the liberties that they took. And I was like, oh, what are you talking about? She's like, you don't know these stories? Like, you're a Christian. Why aren't you reading your Bible, basically? And I was like, why aren't I reading my Bible?
Ouch.
And so that's where I went and started reading my Bible and started trying to like actually educate myself. So
yeah, you've got a personal investment in it. That's great.
Yeah, we're talking about the Noah movie and the comments. Noah was Aronofsky's a talented director who should probably leave the Bible alone.
Yeah.
And so is Ridley Scott.
Yeah, he's made some great movies.
Yeah.
And those biblical epics, not the best, but
it just boggles my mind that it's like when Doug was railing about the DC Comics thing where they're turning Jesus into a superhero thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, guys, do you not realize how much of a built-in audience you have? Just talk to them.
Yeah.
But just make something for them. It's not that hard. But that would mean they'd have to actually treat it with some integrity, which Hollywood isn't willing to do. So,
unfortunately, not in this age.
No, and that's the only reason we got Passion of the Christ is because Mel Gibson went and spent his own money and made it.
Was it his own money even?
Yeah, he self-financed it. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
And then he just picked up a studio to distribute it, basically.
Oh wow. Gosh, don't you love that?
I do.
If it wasn't for independently published movies, we wouldn't have Passion of the Christ. We wouldn't have Star Wars. A few other things.
Yeah. Super good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go. Well, you should. The chaos is a Chaos Tamer. Go look at the DC story on what they're doing. It's pretty blasphemous.
I don't think it's up your alley, Chaos. I'm just gonna say that.
Yeah, it's not. It's not in any way trying to be reverential. It's the exact opposite.
It's God wanted Jesus.
He had to come back to Earth to learn how to be the Messiah because he failed the first time.
Yeah, he screwed it up. He got himself crucified, and he should have become Superman. So he has to be an understudy to some guy called Sunman.
Yeah, basically Superman.
Yeah, that's yeah.
Good for them, I guess.
Yeah.
Have fun with that.
Yeah, that's virtue signaling 2019 right there. That's I don't know what virtue you're signaling by making
it's Doug Turnapel did say something that I would completely botch it, but he was basically sort of saying like one of the reasons Hollywood acts this way is because they know it might be true. Like they're so hostile against it, like they get so angry about it because they can't dismiss it. Like essentially he was saying like they look at Islam or some of the other faiths and like, well, obviously that's just crazy, but they look at Christianity and like, well, we got to put this down because it might be real. And I don't know if I agree with him, but it was a funny observation.
Yeah, what a dig.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a funny.
Well, that does seem to be the case sometimes with like, take for example something like Jesus mythicism. I mean, we don't really have anything like Muhammad mysticism, but
yeah.
I mean, they have so many good scholars who could actually make a decent argument, but no, they're like, oh, Jesus never existed.
Yeah.
What up with that?
Yeah.
I've had an atheist friend of mine, and we used to get together all the time and have lunch and talk through.
Oh, nice.
So essentially just having an ongoing dialogue about this sort of stuff. And he's like, I don't think Jesus existed. And if I have one thing is that by the end of that conversation, he's like, I'll concede I think he was a real person. I was like, I've made some headway. Like, I don't know why we would know about him if he was just some made up person. Certainly didn't benefit anybody at the time to really talk about him that much. So, or to be a believer in him if it wasn't based in some fact.
Yeah, that's a pretty brute fact.
Yeah.
Wasn't advantageous to make that up and to die.
No. And we were just reading. I'm reading through the book of Acts with my kids, and we were reading the passage where the apostles are being interrogated by the Sadducees, and they're basically like trying to decide what they're going to do with them. This is after they were let out of jail and went into the temple and started preaching. And one of the leaders stands up and he's like, look, we've had this happen before. Like we've had other leaders rise up and people come on their side and they all fall away and it's nothing. He's like, so let's just let that happen here. Let's just let them go. And if it's nothing, it'll fizzle into nothing. If it's real, then we're fighting with God. And so it's just sort of interesting how that all played out in the end. But
yeah. Sounds like a legit way to go about it.
Well, they were like, well, they all agreed, and they let him go. And then they just kept plotting to kill him anyway. So they flogged them and then let them go.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. They're like, no, I don't think they did anything wrong, so let's just
beat them. It just swayed them from talking about it.
Just beat him for the principle of the thing.
Yeah.
That's kind of what Pilate did with Jesus, was like, yeah, let's just beat him.
Not awful.
He didn't do anything wrong, but let's beat him to appease the Jews.
I'm coming out 3 times to tell you he didn't do anything wrong.
We'll take him in and scourge him just so we can appease the Jewish leaders, because I'm glad we live in modern times, and let's put it that way. Some wicked justice going on.
Yeah. As bad as some people say it is, it could be worse.
Oh, for sure it could be worse. For sure it could be worse.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if we got to the truth of anything, but it has been a fun discussion.
Oh yeah. Really, it's just fun to just chat, see where we come from.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, thanks, Mike.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. Hopefully, I've done an okayish job in explaining some of my points.
Oh yeah. No, I think you did a better job explaining yourself than I did with mine. And I didn't have as much to express either. So
when my wife calmed me down, I lost a little bit of my concentration and focus. So.
Did you get the look? I'm so surprised. I might get it tomorrow morning. She's going to be like, "Do you know that?"
She walked in at one point and looked at me and was like, "The kids can't sleep. Be quiet." Over. I'll calm down.
Makes sense. Priorities.
Yeah. Well, it was nice to meet you, Hound. Enjoy.
Nice meeting you too.
I have a feeling I would learn a lot from you.
He's a smart cookie.
Yeah.
And thanks also for Kelson for coming in.
Yeah. Maybe we'll get Regan in one time, and he can drop the Orthodox knowledge on us.
Yeah. They also, my impression is they read a lot of First Enoch, but they have a very different view of what that means than what I think the three of us think. So that would be an interesting conversation.
For sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd be up for like the Genesis 1 through 6 conversation at least.
Yeah. Definitely. Sure. We'll bring you in, Hound.
Yeah, just let me know.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
Sounds good.
Okay, cool. Well, everyone has a good evening. Thanks for setting aside time.
This man, it's good
really cool. So,
talk
soon. All right. Thanks everyone for in the chat and watching this now or later. And we'll catch you guys later.